you so much for joining our webinar about how to get adjusted to the new normal of working with, in many cases, an entirely remote team, or I know for many of your organizations, you actually have a mix of people who are working remotely and still some people who are working in person. So we're going to do just a couple of things on this call. We want to facilitate some discussion about your experience going remote during COVID-19, give you lots of practical guidance and tools, and hear your good ideas. So a little bit about our agenda. We want to give some context first for working from home, and then in general, a little bit of more context about what's different about working from home during COVID-19. Because it turns out it's not exactly the same as managing a remote workforce that you already have in place. And then we want to go through 3 areas in great depth that we think are sort of the cornerstones of how to really think effectively about managing a remote team. So those are communication, accountability, and a group of things that we've called culture, connection, and community, the 3 C's. And then we'll have some time to do breakout rooms where you'll get to talk to each other, share some ideas that you've put into practice as a way to kind of connect with each other. As I mentioned earlier, for those of you who are joining later, Matt and I are really delighted because we have a mix of both our nonprofit and employee-owned companies on this call, and so we're looking forward to giving you all a chance to connect with one another, since it's not often that we get to connect people across these 2 sectors. So most of you already know us, but just in case you wanted to just do some quick intros. So the 3 of us work for Praxis Consulting Group, and we do leadership and organization development for nonprofits, healthcare organizations, and employee-owned companies. I've been with Praxis for about 10 years. I do a lot of leadership and team development, as well as a lot of planning and facilitation. Matt, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, I'm Matt Hancock. I've been, this is my 6th year with Praxis. I came into the world of employee ownership, actually living and studying in Bologna, Italy, where there are a lot of employee-owned businesses. And I'm really pleased to be with you all here today and echo Linshuang's enthusiasm around this connection across nonprofit and our employee-owned businesses who are all grappling with this new reality that's been thrust on us.
Great. And Sarah, if she's not tied up with trying to address your tech issues, Sarah, if you're able to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sarah James. You guys were great getting on, so all's well, I think. I've been at Praxis for 10 years. I came here from nonprofit fundraising, and I coordinate our leadership development programs and our marketing, and I've quickly gotten up to speed with webinars, so here we are.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So Sarah's been leading a lot of our marketing efforts and has been coordinating these webinars and providing tech and producing support. So none of this would happen without her. So we're all deeply appreciative of her efforts. So just a couple quick virtual participation norms mentioned earlier. Stay on mute unless you're speaking. Unmute yourself to speak. We really encourage you to use the chat feature. We want our webinars to be interactive, and one of the easiest way to do that is through the chat box. So a couple of things, everyone will see your chat. We encourage you to send it to everyone unless it's a private message. And then because there have been some issues with Zoom security, we ask that you don't send links or click on links, because that's been one of the ways that people have been kind of getting into these Zoom meetings. If you do have some resources to share, you can email them to us. Mm-hmm. If we experience internet instability, we may ask you to turn off your video. If you're experiencing trouble, do let us know so we can figure out if it's an issue with your connection or broader. And as we mentioned earlier, we're going to record, or we are recording, the main webinar, although we may turn off the recording from time to time to encourage conversation. The chat box is not recorded, and the breakout rooms that we'll have later won't be recorded. And then for some reason, if Zoom decides to fail on us today, please check your email. We'll have a backup option in place. I guess with that, I'm going to pass it over to Matt to get us started.
Great. So yeah, a lot of you have used the chat box. We're going to have an opportunity to get to know each other and practice using that chat box. So if you click on chat at the bottom of your screen, the box will pop up. You want to be sending a message to everybody. And we're interested, you've already done some introductions, so if any of you would like to add anything about your organization or about you, feel free to do that. And we're interested in knowing a word or a phrase or an emoji if you're that bold that describes how you're showing up to the webinar today. So a word or a phrase or an emoji that says, hey, here's how I'm showing up to our webinar today. Let me figure out my emoji.
I don't think I know how to do an emoji. I will
No.
have to. I only know how to do the old style with punctuation marks.
I love your honesty, Laura.
Yeah, it looks like most people are curious and eager to learn, and also appreciate a couple people who mentioned being a little tired and maybe in a bad mood, which I think certainly can happen in this new working from home during a crisis context.
Thank you, Sarah, for your empathy for those who are not as fortunate to be able to have a roof over their head and an internet connection and being able to be on a webinar. I think one of the things that we're eager about learning is learning from each other as well. So we hopefully will have some things to share with you, but equally as important is what we're going to learn from each other. Ready to roll. All right. So just in terms of kind of seeing who's in the room, thanks for sharing how you're showing up in the room. And I think it might be helpful if we kind of go through these one by one. The first thing that we're curious to know is how many of you are part of an organization that are experiencing sort of this dual, some of us are working remotely and some of us are still doing our work either on site or in the factory or in the office. So for example, Praxis is completely remote right now. We're not on site at all. Thank you for that clarification. Right now, under the COVID-19 crisis, let us know if you are in an organization where some of your people are still on site, whatever on site means for you. More busy with meetings now that we've experienced that.
Yeah.
So it looks like a mix of 100% remote and then anything between and everything in between there. A number of fully remote and a number of folks that have a mix. Maybe the extreme is the two of you in the office at NBS with everybody else working from home. And of course, some of the work that you do requires things like checking in case, the SAGE's case, with constituents on things like meals. Great, so we've all been experiencing this transition to remote work, or at least under the current circumstances. A lot of us have had the possibility to work remotely, but it's now been imposed on us. So scale of 1 to 10, how has that transition gone from the pre-COVID-19 to now the remote reality that you're in right now? 1 being not well at all, 10, it's gone great.
Yep. And feel free to elaborate if you want to.
Thanks, Linshuang. I'm gonna bring the mean down a little bit.
Seems like a real mix, like a good number of really high 8s and 9s and 10s, and also a couple of you who I think it may be more mixed experience. I see some 5s and 7s, 5, 6, and 7s.
hard to disregard that, Daniel.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a mental stress that can be exhausting that goes with this. So final check-in. Has something unexpected happened? One way that you were not expecting, that you've been impacted or affected by working remotely? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
I see a lot of themes about a lot more work, right? A lot more meetings, and unexpected, some unexpected exhaustion or tiring,
Mhm.
which have been things that certainly we've heard. And also some challenge of managing like different family situations, whether it's for yourself or for your team members. And then a couple of you have actually mentioned that you're actually feeling like you're working very effectively remotely. So that's encouraging to see too.
Thanks for sharing, honestly, this range of experiences from working from home. I suspect that for a lot of us, I don't want to speak for all of us, but we're all experiencing that spectrum and can see the positive and experience the challenges. And hopefully, again, this webinar and the opportunity to connect will help make this more easy, more effective, more satisfying. That is the cutest thing ever. So as we think about working from home, remote work, remember we used to call it telecommuting? It's been with us for a while. And it's also something that still causes, for good reason, lots of trepidation, concern among managers. I have not dressed like this yet from my work at home experience, but I've come dangerous to the coast on some days. But when managers are surveyed or interviewed about their concerns with work from home, the things that come up, the reasons why they don't like it, include things like it's just more challenging to coordinate teams when we're not all under one roof. Tony Hsieh uses the term from Zappos, serendipitous collisions, and that's one of the things that the office is good for. I couldn't have planned it, but we bumped into each other on the way to the water cooler, and we had a conversation that sparked something. So that can't happen if we're all in different places. Overall, communication is more challenging, and there is a recurring theme around this issue of trust. If I can't see people doing the work, how do I know that it's really getting done? The good news is we also know a lot about how work from home impacts people and how it impacts organizations, and it's overwhelmingly positive. This is research that we're summarizing from Gallup, but you get greater employee engagement and satisfaction, which leads to higher productivity. Now, the productivity boost, estimates go anywhere from 5 to 10% to something like 50%. But on the whole, it seems like there's a productivity increase. Now, again, these were surveys and research done before the global pandemic. And then there's something around retention of employees. And I'm looking like some of you are saying not surprised by this. But there's something around that connects, employees are connecting around the engagement and the flexibility that it gives them that seems to result in increased retention. Now, this doesn't happen by magic just because we're allowing people to work from home. The fact of the matter is it does take a lot more, I think, of leaders and of managers to create the conditions by which work from home can result in these kinds of outcomes. And the next slide summarizes some of that. And this is really what the meat of our webinar and conversation with you is about. So how do we establish norms, but also allow for flexibility in individualization? How do we think about communication, setting clear expectations, and balancing that with the need for autonomy and accountability? And finally, how do we be deliberate about creating a sense of community now that we're all working from home? That's what we're going to dive into today with you.
Yep. So that's all the research about what it takes to work from home successfully during normal times. And as we all know, this isn't normal times. So last week, I actually just stumbled upon this in my LinkedIn feed. Unfortunately, I can't remember who posted it, but it was a set of reminders or principles for working remote during COVID-19. And the first one really resonated with me. You are not working from home. You are at home during a crisis trying to work. And I think it's really important to remember that's the bigger context that we're operating in. And actually this one thing from LinkedIn had some other elements that I think are some good principles to keep in mind about being kind to oneself during this time. Acknowledging that there's going to be some drop in productivity and that it can be hard to simply want to keep working longer hours, right? Even though there's a lot of mental and physical and emotional drains that people are experiencing. So we wanted to hold that kind of as the bigger context for having this. There are many principles that we're going to be sharing that are broadly applicable for people when you're working from home, and we want to be mindful of the context. So a couple of things, and we talked about the importance of establishing working hours, and I think this is one of the most important things that organizations can do, if you haven't done it already, to help people navigate and figure out a sustainable way of working. So I think big picture, be mindful of the context and also considerate about those who have to work in person. Many of you have mixed workforces, and as we get into this, I think there is some value to really making sure that you're structuring whatever you do around those who do have to work in person. The next thing is it's really helpful to set clear expectations around work hours and productivity. And that can look different depending on your organization. So some people may set a daily expectation. Some people might be a week, just a rough ballpark for people. Other times you may actually say, you know, we don't really care about the number of hours you work, but you and your manager need to make sure that you accomplish a certain amount of work each week and that you're generally available in these times for meetings. So that can look different. The other thing that we found is that a lot of organizations have experienced a drop in productivity during this time. Totally normal as people are getting adjusted. It takes longer to do things. And so some organizations are actually adjusting their expectations of employees to prevent burnout. So that might mean prioritizing certain work and may mean delaying some things because they're less urgent and really trying to figure out how to manage some of that. And then also, obviously, a lot of you mentioned this in the chat, right? It's not just working from home. Many of you are caring for kids. You may have sick relatives. You may be dealing with family members that have lost a job or are sick or are scared or whatever that might be. And so that really speaks to, depending on your business, really figuring out how to be flexible. So just to give some examples, you know, one organization found it was much better to do a lot of their meetings in the afternoon because that was when people were least weighed down by childcare responsibilities. It may mean providing some flexibility. So maybe people don't have to work an exact 9 to 5 as long as they complete their work. As long as, you know, if there's an emergency, people can answer the phone and respond within 15 or 20 minutes. So just depending on what the nature of your work is, it really is helpful to set some expectations about availability, especially since many of you mentioned there is an inclination to want to work 24/7. Which sometimes is appropriate if you're in a crisis or crunch situation. And if you're mindful of the fact that we may be in this for who knows how long, right? At least like a month, another month or two, if not longer, it's really important to be thinking about sustainability. So with that, we have a couple questions to just invite you to respond in the chat box about what has resonated so far. Maybe we'll start with the first question.
One of my favorite norms that I've heard is kids on internal meetings, okay. Kids on client meeting conference, video conference is not okay. Hmm.
Mhm. So a lot of people resonated with the quote about working from home during a crisis as opposed to just working remotely, and appreciate the need to be empathetic to others.
Hmm. Challenges around working long hours and struggling to find work balance. That's certainly something that's common in a time like this.
So curious about, many of you have already mentioned that your transition to working has been successful. So some of you have already gone into that, but to hear a little bit more about where have you been successful in supporting working from home? So there's one great example of encouraging staff to quit at a certain point, right? Turn off their email and computers. Um, Um, One of you mentioned training coaches on how to coach during a crisis, and being able to empower people in your organization to coach one another. It's a wonderful example.
You need to maybe think more about agile, quick touch point meetings, different for some. How to transition to remote work and not either replicate or exacerbate maybe some um, negative organizational dynamics that we started with, particularly around dominant and subordinate groups. And there's something about having some self-discipline to build your own schedule, regardless of what the organization's schedule is. One of the recommendations we've seen is, if possible, to try to make it the same as what a normal work day would be. This is the time, yep, you're going to get over a lot of tech phobias. So I'm wondering if you would just do a quick ping around where you feel that you've been particularly successful, or is that what you're on to now already? These sound like some successes. Great, so success around Teams or video meetings, check in and stay connected. We're seeing a theme in general around this need to be deliberate about when you're going to check in and how frequently to check in. Using technology tools like Microsoft Teams. There's a lot of new technology I think we all didn't know about a couple weeks ago. Yeah, that's a good one. Your manager can't see you. You can't kind of walk by on the way to the kitchen and pop in. So a deliberate check-in in the morning, and then a suggestion for mindfulness or relaxation. And I'm sure they appreciate the humorous cartoon as well. Some of you have used Teams to do brainstorming and feel that you've gotten everyone a chance to have a voice, reminding people about self-care. At the University of Pennsylvania, they have a competition. You earn points for doing self-care. and they've sort of gamified the self-care thing. Using team groups, sending affirmation quotes. What, you've actually got a water cooler at Sage. That's great. Maybe you could email us, not send a link in the chat, but email us a picture of your virtual water cooler. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
All right, give us a sense of what's been challenging for you. Oh, great. So Sentry's got a self-care challenge. Meetings, lots of meetings have been challenging.
I feel like the chat box is going really quickly. I'm having a little trouble keeping up. It feels like my email inbox.
I mean, that one longer post was really interesting, and it spoke to the need to be others and to be also mindful of where you as leaders and managers are learning to juggle these new things and use these new tools and lead a team. And so you might have to back burner some of the work, some of your core work, to be there for the team while you're learning all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, turning off the cameras. Yeah, that's one of the reasons we encouraged you to all turn on your cameras is tone and body language. We don't have the benefit of being in the same room, and that's so much about communication is the things we don't say.
Some interesting concerns about cybersecurity. For one of you that works for an LGBT organization, having anti-LGBT intruders. And then one of you also mentioned just the trauma that staff may be experiencing in terms of hearing about what your clients are going through. So I just want to acknowledge that and the difficulty of doing that.
There's the impact that it's having on your clients and your ability to continue to collaborate with them and get things that you need in a timely fashion.
Yep. Some practical things too. I've heard one of you mention just multiple people in your home all at a screen, right? Trying to do different work from home. And also just the tiredness sometimes of being in front of a computer all day.
Mm.
And a lot about having challenges connecting with people, right? Having that be a little bit more difficult.
Mm. There's these behind the scenes things like policy work to stay ahead of compliance issues. There's lots of implications to this type of extreme remote work. Oh no, some of your clients are just totally separated from their actual data. That's going to make it hard.
Yeah.
We were discussing this morning as a team internally. There's a way that this crisis is taking inequalities and magnifying those. Feeling the tension to be, the stress to be available at all times. And then of course the digital divide that existed before, again, another inequity that's magnified by the crisis. These are really thoughtful, and thanks for sharing them with us, both the successes, but also the very real challenges, and the multidimensionality of those challenges, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, we really appreciate people's honesty. And I think as a frame, we don't have magical solutions in this webinar. We want to sort of share what we know, what we've learned, what we've heard, and then encourage people. In some ways, we're all in a period of experimentation to share what you have learned, what you found has worked well. So we want to talk first about communication. And I guess before we get into to acknowledge that it is a privilege to be able to work from home, right? Not everyone can do it, and not everyone necessarily has the technological access. We haven't gone into that detail in this webinar, but we know that a lot of organizations have really taken steps to try and help some of their staff get laptops or get hotspots so they can get online. We're not going into that in a whole lot of depth, but I think that often is an important area, especially if you're working in an organization where people are of different socioeconomic classes, to make sure that everyone is even able to, have a space where they can do work. But on to communication, a lot of you have mentioned that there is just a lot more communication that happens, especially in email. And sometimes I feel like I get on a video call and then I go to my email and all of a sudden there's 20 emails in my inbox. And it can be hard to know what's a brainstorming idea, what somebody, maybe I can't tell what somebody really means, and maybe I think they're upset, but it's hard to tell. Not sure if I always need to respond. And then many of you mentioned just a lot of additional meetings, right? So what used to be, Matt and I used to sit across the office, in the same office together. We used to come in the morning and chat to each other, bounce some ideas. All of a sudden, that either has to be a scheduled phone call or it's an email. And so I think a lot of us are adjusting to that. There's sort of different boundaries for phone calls, home life, interruptions. It's easy to go 24/7. And then for those of you who have a mixed in-person and remote workforce, I think this really makes the divide even bigger. I think a lot of you have mentioned before, if you had a manufacturing and corporate or corporate and services, direct services split, all of that is becoming even more divided with the shift to remote work. So here are some of the things that we're learning as far as best practices during this time. And then also encourage, as you're listening in, to share some of your ideas. So one of the first thing is to have consideration and empathy for those working in person. So if that's the case for your organization, in some ways they need to be central to whatever your communication strategy is. So really working with those in person to figure out what they need. Right? They may not want to be inundated with email all day long, and they may want to make sure that there is a person that they can call if there are any issues, that there may be a liaison, a person that is the point person to make sure that they're checking in with the field every day, hear what people need, and communicating that back. So for those of you who have a mixed workforce, I think that is one of the central pieces to be thinking about, is to talk to people who are working in person, know what they need, know what's the right mix of communication and involvement that they need. The second thing that we encourage is actually to set some norms and expectations for how you might want to communicate. And in a lot of cases, you may have already developed these a little bit ad hoc, and it can help to make it explicit just to make sure that it's really clear. So there's lots of different ways to communicate. So email, we encourage people not to use it for everything because it's easy to get overwhelmed. Some of you may have a chat function in your email or through Teams. A lot of organizations mentioned using Teams. There's other tools like Slack and other project management tools that can often help manage the quantity of email. So for instance, here at Praxis, we're trying to do some more work on Slack because we're doing lots of brainstorming about what kinds of webinars or articles we want to be putting out. And not all of that needs to happen through email. We're trying to do it through Slack. And I think one of you also mentioned you have like a fun water cooler channel on your Teams, right? Where people can just post pet pictures, post something fun, and it helps to recreate that experience in the office in the online format. And it can also be really helpful to set response time expectations, both in terms of hours and timeliness. So people don't feel like, some people may choose to work in the evening because they're tied up with certain things during the day. Do people put a delay on their email? Or is there an expectation that people don't need to respond if email's coming around late in the evening, unless they choose to? Or if it's during the day and people may be tied up with family expectations, or maybe you're encouraging people to go outside and take a walk with safe social distancing just to get away from the screen, that maybe people aren't expected to respond unless it's an emergency, to give people some leeway around that. So just to share an example, here might be like a sample communication norms that you might want to create with your team. You can create it and then live with it for 2 weeks and then see how it's working. Chances are some things might shift. So here's some examples of how you might want to do that. So it has the method and then when you might want to use it. So for instance, texting, that's probably something you don't want to do during non-working hours, right? Only during working hours, so if people really need to reach somebody or for something urgent or some issues with technology. So these are just some examples of how you might want to set some norms in your group. So I'm just going to check to see if there's anything in chat. Yes. It's interesting, there's a comment about how often we make some assumptions, but we don't always know. And in some ways, the shift to remote has happened so quickly, people are just doing whatever works. And it helps to regroup from time to time to say what's working, what's not. If something's not working, let's try something else. I know in our own experience at Praxis shifting to remote, we've had to move a lot of things from long email discussions to just some quick 15-minute phone calls to resolve issues quickly. Right, so we want to move on to talk about accountability, though encourage you at any point to comment on anything we're saying or ask any questions. So with accountability, we actually have a chat box question for all of you, which is how is accountability the same or different now that people are remote? So I'd love to invite people to respond to that. I think while we're waiting for people to chat in some of their answers, one of the things we're finding with all the different technology tools available is that it helps to ease people in because it can be overwhelming to do all the tools all at once. And so there may be a strategy where, you know, first week, let's just get everyone onto video conference. And then maybe in 2 weeks, let's get more people onto Teams, or in 4 weeks, let's get more people onto this other tool, just so people aren't overwhelmed. So really some wide-ranging comments about accountability. So some mentioned at least it was first more centralized at first. Needing to balance oversight and flexibility. Some of you having deadlines driven by your clients or your work products, so a lot of that is still the same.
There was an interesting comment about asking people, or you feel like you're working too much, and who has more time available. So maybe a way of balancing that out.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, as a big picture, accountability in the remote world isn't necessarily that much different than accountability in the non-remote world. Like the same principles apply. It's just that we don't have some of the natural signs of whether or not somebody is working available to us. So before, when we were able to see somebody in the office, we're pretty sure that they're working. We don't really have those signs anymore. And the principles for accountability stay the same. So here are some thoughts about how to manage accountability in this new environment. So we mentioned this for helpful accountability at any time, which is to develop shared expectations, whether that's at the team or with the manager and direct report. And that really should include like what somebody's working on and why, like what's the big picture, what are they trying to accomplish? And then associated with that, getting agreement about what are they trying to accomplish, what's the timeline. And many of you have mentioned that's still the same, right? You still have your client work that you're delivering. And some of you also mentioned that with COVID-19, you're also having to respond to COVID-19 related issues. So there may be some new work that's surfacing as a result of that. So even with that, it's really important to develop shared expectations about, okay, what are we trying to accomplish here? And if there's going to be more work because of COVID-19, what might be delayed? What might be adjusted? Is there somebody else that could help? That would be really, really helpful. A tool that we've seen some organizations use that is really helpful is actually creating like a daily or weekly board of people's projects. And there's some fancy software that can do it. So Trello is one. I'm not sure what the features are like in Teams, but it's possible. You could also just do this in a shared Google Doc, right? It's kind of a very simple technology that more people are familiar with, where you might just encourage every week for people to list their name, to put in some goals for the week, and actually talk about what their progress, successes, challenges, if they need support. This would also be a good place for people to indicate, I have too much work, I need help, or, oh, I actually don't have much going on this week and I need some support, or I can help some other people. The nice thing about this is, especially if you're working with a department, it gives some visibility to other people about what's going on. So it also helps people stay coordinated and be aware of what other people are working on. That might be something to play around if you haven't already done something like that. It's also really helpful to really just think about some regular check-in processes. So I know many of you mentioned having regular team meetings or individual meetings with your manager. And it really helps to figure out what the regular rhythm is. I have one friend whose team ended up meeting every day on a conference call, which was a little bit too much. They didn't quite need to coordinate at that level, although maybe weekly makes sense, right? And with an individual, maybe it's once a week or once every 2 weeks that you're checking in to see what people are working on, what support they might need. And that may also be customized, right? So I think there are some employees that may be really independent. It's important to stay connected with them once a week, once every 2 weeks. And you may actually have somebody on your team that, especially right at the beginning, actually needs to check in every day, right? Just to get regrouped, to figure out what they're focused on. So this is an important place to be flexible depending on what people need. The other thing is that this is a really, really important time to try not to micromanage. It can be especially tempting if you don't see people, or, you know, as people have family issues or other things that they're tied up, they may not be immediately responsive to every email that you send. So it's really important not to jump to the conclusion that just because someone's not there, they haven't responded, that they're not getting work done. The important thing is to set the shared expectations for what needs to be accomplished and to really manage to that, right? Rather than to whether somebody is at their computer or at their desk. It's really checking to see, is the work that they promised that they would do, is that work getting finished? So Matt, I have not been able to manage the chat box because I don't know how to talk and read at the same time. I'm wondering if there's any interesting comments that have come up.
I think actually, I was going to say that the chat here is particularly rich, and I think, you know, we want to definitely make this part of what you all get back as a result of the participation. But I'm seeing lots of notions around empathy, around using, being more intentional about checking in with people, thinking about more grace. How does our culture, and this is, you know, came up in the context of an employee-owned organization. We are all employee owners, and so that there's a sense of mutual accountability to each other that you kind of had going into this. But this idea of support, asking people what they need, being empathetic, recognizing the conditions under which people are working. Linshuang, are you able to hit mute all so that and then when people are talking, they can unmute themselves?
Sure.
Is there some background noise?
You may need to unmute yourself after I do this.
I will. Great. Okay. So I think it just sounds like you're being very attuned to the challenging circumstances that people are working under, appreciative of the often Herculean efforts that people are going to, and thinking about ways of supporting them, including one leader saying, you know what, the staff just worked really hard to help serve the organization and set us up for financial sustainability. I'm going to give people a week off to try to sort of come to grips with what does this mean for the rest of their lives outside of work while I man the fort. So lots of attention to to output, but also the context under which people are working and how do we best support.
Right. I I'm especially struck by some of the the comments about just having grace and forgiveness, right? A meeting didn't go so well or something didn't quite get met, to just give people a little space to make some mistakes, try again, figure out what's next, and not really holding that against somebody. So great, so shall we move on to the next topic?
Are you handing it over to me, Linshuang? Sorry.
Yes, I think so.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So I think, there's a way in which you've already pointed this out, that this is a time where we need to be deliberate about staying connected. I think there's also a way to think about how do we use our culture as a way of anchoring ourselves, as a way of being a compass for navigating these turbulent times, and also a need to be deliberate about maintaining a sense of community, because our proverbial water cooler is lost right now. Oops, sorry, I clicked off the. I think you have to advance the slide. Sorry, Linshuang.
Okay. No problem.
We lose, because we're not in meetings, the opportunity to sort of hear the nonverbal or be aware of the nonverbal communication. But there's a way that we express body language digitally, and it's things like making decisions around who do I CCC, when do I use BCC. In our office, I think we're encouraged people to think, do I really need to CC that person? The order in which we're sending emails, our use of punctuation, and how that can be communicative of intention, of tone, expectations around response time, and being aware of the kinds of messages that we're sending and what we're expecting of others. I think there's also at least the first thing that blew up for me was my inbox once we all moved to remote. So I think it has to do with also being aware of the actual volume, the number of these text, emails, chats that we're using. And so there's just a mindfulness around what kind of message are we sending with our digital body language, and being deliberate about tone when we're communicating. There's the facts of what we're communicating, and then there's the intention, and there's the tone. So there's just a number of different things that are important to be mindful of.
Yeah. Yep. So just to give a practical example, we had a colleague at Praxis who was just really full of a lot of ideas and resources, and we made the shift to remote work. And she would just send like a gazillion emails to us in the spirit of, here are some resources, here's some ideas, I'm trying to be helpful. And it ended up being overwhelming for some of us, because it was like 10 emails from one person. What do I do with this? And it was actually helpful to have a conversation to say, hey, what are you expecting with these emails, right? Should I respond to them? And it was really helpful to hear, no, I'm just sending out some ideas. So no need to respond. You can just sort of take them as quick little thoughts.
I've been using our Google Hangouts a lot more to, instead of texting somebody, do a quick visual, chat with them. And we've been introducing Slack as well as a way of moving some of that stuff off of email. Can you move to the next slide, Linshuang? Thanks. So I think we've talked about this, but being deliberate about norms, just as we were around work hours and expectations. Also expectations around digital communication. What do we expect in terms of response time? And here's some suggestions for, sort of codes, way you can label things. This is just for information. I'm not expecting a response, versus here's the level of urgency and the kind of response time I'm looking for. This is always easier said than done. But especially now, it's really helpful for us all to assume positive intent. Everybody's working under really adverse conditions. We can never know what someone's intention is. It's even easier for things to fall through the cracks, or for us to miss things because we're not face to face. And so if you can start off with a position of curiosity, why are they communicating that way? It's making me feel this way. I know that they mean well. That can be really helpful. Sorry, I'm checking out the chat right now. And it looks like there's a best practice maybe here, or a highly effective practice from Laura at Nelly, with a practical example of how to managing a meeting around email best practices. So I won't summarize that, but it's there for you all as a resource. And we'll give you a chance during the breakouts to share more of those. And here are just some ideas for, as you think about staying connected without the proverbial water cooler. Being deliberate about using check-in and check-out questions in meetings as a way of getting people into the room and connecting. Think about, you might run into someone in the kitchen at work and stop for coffee. Why not give them a text and say, hey, you want to take a coffee break, and we'll just do a quick chat. A number of organizations, Linshuang, I think you've participated in some already, are doing virtual happy hours. So everyone can make their drink of choice and check in over Zoom. We recommend turning the video on when you're using video conferencing now more than ever so we can see each other. We've talked about using things like Slack. It's called asynchronous communication, meaning I can engage in the conversation on my own time. Could be in the middle of the night, it could be early in the morning. It's there and it lives there. Thinking about how to incorporate fun and games into the workday. People are doing things like electronic bingo. They're sending in pictures of my new workstation or my new office buddy, my cat, my dog, my children. So those are some ideas for staying connected. Linshuang, can you say just something about the buddy system?
Yes, and actually somebody has mentioned that they have a buddy system in place. It's just this idea of you may want to assign some peer relationships where people are going to check in regularly with each other. So somebody at least once a week, they're going to check in for half an hour, hear how each other are doing, just to make sure nobody really gets lost in the cracks. And for someone who mentioned their system, feel free to share more detail about it.
And it's okay for those of you who might have to check out because things have come up in the office. We understand. Yeah. Thank you for joining us. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So I think you're all, it sounds like, keenly attuned to the issue of burnout, the issues around mental, physical, and emotional health of your employees. And we just want to offer I'm sorry, I just got distracted by a chat. Let me come back to the burnout issue. A pet photos Slack channel. Best organizational communication channel we've ever had. So there you go. Actually, Praxis, I think, is big. I've seen a bunch of pet photos on one of our Slack channels. I think you're all keenly aware of the issue of burnout, particularly at a time right now. And we just wanted to share with you a model for thinking about burnout and some tools for addressing it as leaders and as managers. And I think you'll see a lot of the conversation that you've been having on chat, the tools that we've been talking about, really all contribute to helping employees manage and avoid burnout. So there's a relationship between psychological demands of work, and as the psychological demands go up, Linshuang, you can hit the animation. There's a way that the increased psychological demands can translate into burnout and actually adverse health effects for individuals, or maybe paradoxically, but if we get into it a little bit, maybe it'll seem more obvious, it can set the stage for a satisfying, rewarding work experience that's about learning and development. And the two variables that make all the difference in the world when someone's faced with increasing demands at work are the degree to which they have autonomy. So this is I'm sorry, the smiley face is satisfying, healthy work that leads to a sense of accomplishment and learning, and the heart disease there sign is really about burnout, and there's an association with burnout and long-term heart risks. So the degree to which I enjoy autonomy and some measure of control over my work, and the degree to which I enjoy support, and support is in the form of from my supervisor, but it's also, and critically, the social support that I get from my social networks at work. So if we've got increasing psychological demands, and if we as leaders and managers can think about ways of giving people more control and ways of giving people more support, it can turn that potentially burnout situation into a highly satisfying situation. And just to fill out the model, the top left hand, the low demanding, high autonomy job, that's our like basic research scientists, college professors. And if you've got a low demanding job, but also low autonomy, you oftentimes find that those are people that are withdrawn at work and oftentimes withdrawn outside of work. So this comes from a thing called the demand control support model. And it just gives you as leaders and managers 3 different levers that you can work on. Can we work on making some of the aspects of the job less demanding? Can we increase support both from me as a supervisor, but also creating a stronger social network? And can we help people find a sense of increased autonomy or increased opportunities to have control over the work that they do? So I think that's enough in terms of content. We wanted to give you some ideas, practical tools. We also wanted to give you a framework for thinking about how to help people manage the dangers of burnout in your work. And we want to turn it over to you now to jump into breakouts. We're going to give you 15 minutes for the breakout. I think Linshuang is going to hit the buttons that break you up into rooms. That's no problem that you need to jump out. Thank you for being on with us this far, and look for notes and a summary from the breakout rooms. So in terms of norms, think about, you've got 15 minutes, sharing the air and making sure everybody in your breakout room is involved. We'd like to ask one person to volunteer as a reporter to take notes, because we're going to ask you to send us that Word doc so that we can summarize that. And we would like also that reporter to be prepared to share just some highlights with the whole group. Give us a flavor of your conversation and maybe some key conclusions that you're drawing, or key findings, if you will.
Great.
So I think the next, go ahead,
yeah.
Linshuang.
Oh, sorry. We're probably about to do the same thing. So this is what it will look like